Okay, good morning everyone. I'm honored to be chairing the session today with a great group of scholars. I'm going to just introduce them as they come up to speak, and then at the end tie together some of their insights and then pose a few questions for them before we open it up to question and answer. And just to let them know, I'm quite strict with time, so I will be giving you warnings as you go and making sure that there's plenty of time for discussion. So first we're going to start off with a keynote address, sort of to sum up the larger issues with Paul Shaffer. He's an associate professor in international development studies at Trent University. He's known for his Q-squared approach to poverty analysis, which combines qualitative and quantitative methods. So he's going to come up and give us some just opening remarks before we get into the individual presentations. And we have all of our speakers here, so that's great news. So each speaker will have to come up here when it's their time. So Paul.
And it's a real pleasure to be here at the opening of ASAP Canada. And once again, just to second some of the other remarks that were made, special thanks, I think, have to go to Me Too for putting this together under very, very tight time constraints. So Me Too, my hat goes off to you for doing this. In my introductory remarks on this panel on growth, employment, and inequality, I want to say a few words about three things that will be touched on in different ways by the panelists. Now, these three things are concepts, causes, and remedies. Or otherwise put, what we're talking about in the first place, what causes it, nature of the causal structure, and what to do about it. Now, I'm gonna limit these comments just to poverty and inequality. In the broader debates about what has happened over time to poverty and inequality, the devil is really in the details. And there's really two issues here. One is measurement. And some of us in this room have contributed to these measurement debates. I'm not going to say anything about that. But the other devil is concepts, what we're talking about. And just about all the interesting findings in the literature really turned on our initial definition of these words, poverty and inequality. So let me begin by offering some preliminary distinctions, which once again will be addressed in due course. First, in terms of inequality, typically what we mean by inequality is the spread of something over an entire population. And that something can be many things. Sometimes we think about it in terms of income or consumption, but it can be anything which attaches to units in your distribution. So health, nutritional outcomes, education, or what have you. A subsequent distinction is between global inequality, or inequality both within and between countries in the world, as well as national inequality, or what's happening just within countries. And for the latter, big sweeping generalizations don't really help, because country experience is quite varied. China, you see this huge spike to levels that are just about the highest in the world. Latin America, seeing the opposite trend, or apparently you've seen the opposite trend, at least in some countries. So I think these are some of the issues that Albert and Randy are going to unpack a little bit and discuss further. The second point about poverty, and typically when we say the word poverty, we mean those below some kind of cutoff. Now, this cutoff can be defined in totally different ways, and it is defined in very different ways in the literature. Same point applies in terms of poverty of what? Can be income, consumption, or a whole bunch of different dimensions of deprivation. Now, there's one strand in the literature that looks to see if these different aspects of poverty or deprivation are closely correlated. So can you use one as a marker or an indicator of the others? And typically the short answer is no, that there's a relationship, but it's not that tight. And I think this is my understanding of some of what Murtaza Haider is going to talk about when he presents results of two different surveys undertaken in Pakistan, one in Lahore, one nationally. Former looked at consumption, expenditure, the latter nutritional outcomes. I think they painted a very, very different picture of what's going on. So bottom line, just by way of introduction, this is a caveat emptor. Everything interesting in debates about what has happened over time turns on what we mean by these words at the beginning. Okay, second point, causes, causation. Here I want to say a couple things. And the first thing is that there is a very strong empirical finding in the literature, if you believe the data. And this finding is that there is a positive relationship between growth of consumption and poverty reduction. And poverty defined in terms of consumption or income. Now, the finding is strong in the sense that it doesn't seem really to matter if you change the dates or the countries or if you estimate the relationship differently. And in some circles, much is made of this, and you say, oh, trickle-down works, and so on and so forth. For me, I don't happen to find this result particularly surprising or very interesting. It's not surprising because you're not going to expect to see reductions in poverty in the context of negative growth or recession. And it's not very interesting for me, because what really is interesting are the outliers, the countries that have done particularly well or particularly poorly, and the reasons why. And this is why I think inequality is so important, because inequality mediates the relationship between growth and poverty reduction. And here the evidence is very strong. The more unequal you are, the worse you do with respect to poverty reduction. So the question is why? What is inequality telling us that mediates this relationship? Well, you can think about inequality and what it actually means in different ways. And one way to think about it is by looking at those below the line or at the bottom end and saying inequality reflects exclusion of people from active participation in the economy and social life and so on. So that's one way to look at it. But the other way to think about inequality and its mediating role is that inequality is a marker of how society is structured, the nature of social stratification and privilege. So when thinking about causes, it redirects an inquiry away from correlates of the poor or those at the bottom end to the joint production of poverty and wealth. And this is how I understand the comments of Solomon Benatar, at least in one of the preliminary papers that he wrote. And so in talking about the burden of morbidity and mortality associated with TB, he writes, and I'll quote, that it's increasing because of failures associated with how human society is structured and function. And then he consequently makes a plea for the social determinants of health. Now, this isn't the only way to think of poverty, but I think we all can think of empirical examples of this in the real world. So it would be odd if this type of analysis didn't figure anywhere. One final point about causes, and this is about employment. And employment is another big mediator of this growth-poverty relationship because it bears on how many jobs are being created, or in jargon, employment elasticities of growth, as well as the nature of those jobs, whether it's low-end sector jobs or better-paying jobs. And there's much that can be said about employment, but I'm going to tailor these remarks, again, to what I understand Murtaza Haider is going to talk about. And this has to do with the distribution of firms, the firm size distribution, and the fact that in many countries in Asia, there's a so-called missing middle in this distribution. Deepak Mazumdar, who's going to come later, has written on this for many, many years. But the fact that there are relatively fewer medium-sized firms tends to be bad for poverty and inequality. Not everywhere, but in many countries. It's bad for poverty because you're creating fewer jobs. It's bad for inequality because the dispersion of wages in manufacturing is much higher. And it's higher between manufacturing and other sectors, like services. So in Murtaza Haider's discussion of Pakistan, he makes reference to the failure of the private sector to generate a sufficient number of jobs because of the preferred allocation of resources to the military and to the civilian elite, which in his view has perverse effects on the level of violence and so on. So in any event, this is at least one of the ways that employment matters for poverty reduction and inequality. Okay, final issue are remedies, what to do. And in the presentations, there are a range of suggestions which operate at both the supranational and national levels. So supranationally, Randy discusses issues of financial instability, new financial architecture related with capital flows, as well as climate warming. I should say global warming. Solomon Benatar talks about the need for a new global political economy with particular emphasis on questions of debt, trade, and so on. At the national level, Al Berry focuses on three things, which are smallholder agriculture, increasing productivity, support for non-ag enterprises, and then employment policies, and return to full employment as a policy, as an explicit policy objective. Randy also talks about technologies, ICTs, and other. Okay, so bottom line, this is my take on how these things hang together, concept, causes, and remedies. But I'm very glad to return to Roberta and the panel to sort it all out. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Our first speaker, we're going in alphabetical order, is Professor Albert Berry, a Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Toronto. He's well known for his work on Latin America with a focus on labor markets and income distribution, as well as agrarian structure and reform. He has worked with the Ford Foundation, the Colombian Planning Commission, and the World Bank. And I can honestly say he's one of the most beloved professors at UofT. The students really enjoy him, always talking about him. In his presentation today, he'll be looking at recent trends in poverty, inequality, and economic insecurity, as well as priority policy areas for arresting these trends. So please, Professor Berry.
Thank you, Roberta, and thank you to everyone who participated in organizing this discussion, which I am confident is going to be interesting and useful in a lot of different ways. So I want to act as the somewhat self-critical economist here. I often discuss with students who have their suspicions about economics as a discipline, and my take on that is you have to have it. It's a very important component of the interdisciplinary thinking that's necessary when one's worrying about development issues. You can't throw the discipline out, even though you should throw some of the economists out, because they oversimplify. They have a bunch of weak spots and sins which give the discipline a bad name sometimes. And one of those, which I'll come back to later, is the prioritization in practice, if not in theory, of growth as what matters. Growth is the measure of success. And of course, growth is a necessary condition for a lot of other good things, but it is not the definition of success for an economy or for a society. And oversimplification is one of the great threats to, I think, to wise thinking about development issues. I hate to possibly deprecate a former U.S. president, but the idea that Reagan could only handle a one-page memo, it's a very important idea because there are a lot of people in the decision-making process who can only handle one-page memos. And if that one-page memo says growth, that's where it's going to end. And that's what we as economists have too frequently done. So I want to come back to that later on. And as Paul said, I want to talk about employment as a somewhat separate objective of a society, not just number of jobs, obviously, but quality of jobs. And then interrelated with that, equality. So let me step back a little bit and give you a few of the, what I guess we would call standard or stylized facts. What has happened? What's the state of play with respect to poverty, inequality, employment in developing countries, and what are the trends in recent years? So I'm going to stick to the definition of poverty and inequality that focuses on income or consumption, admitting, as Paul said, that we should think in terms of all the other variables that people consider relevant. Access to health, access to education, psychological satisfaction, and so on. But let's start with the part that, because of our focus on income and consumption, at least as economists who organize a lot of this data, that's what we know the most about, the level of inequality in those variables and the trends. So what do we know? Well, we certainly know that inequality is horrendously high in many, in probably most developing countries. Depends on your moral judgment as to what is high. But I often cite Brazil, Paraguay, and South Africa. They're certainly three of the front runners when it comes to inequality. And to give you a quick quantitative fix, the top 10% in terms of income in each of those three countries has about 50 to 55 times more income per capita than the bottom 10%. So those are huge numbers of people at the bottom and the top in any big country. So we're not just talking about the top 1/2 of 1%. We're talking about the top 10%, 50 times more income than the bottom. So morally, can one justify that? I think the answer does not require much thought. Economically, can one justify it? Well, as Paul just pointed out, the evidence tends to say that highly unequal countries do worse economically. And exactly why, still a matter of research, but that seems to be the tendency over the last decades. So if there's neither a moral nor an economic justification, then I think policy of all sorts should be directed to lowering the degree of inequality, which again, as Paul pointed out, more or less automatically lowers the level of economic poverty, other things being equal. So the levels are very high, and the next question is, what are the trends? Well, we have 50 years ago, I think there was no developing country which had enough data to draw a reasonably good picture of the level of inequality or of its trends. And now, increasingly, one can say a lot about most countries in the developing world. And what one can say, so we're mainly talking about the last 3 to 4 decades, depending on which country, which part of the world we're talking about. What are the trends? The trends go in both directions. So it's not everybody getting higher inequality or everybody getting lower, but there has been a predominance of increasing inequality over the last 30 years. And if you weight countries, if you try to do kind of a world average or a developing country average, weighting countries by their population, then it's a clear increase over the last 30 years. And that's substantially affected by the fact that the two biggest countries in the world have shown big increases in inequality. China, hard to analyze because the data are difficult, but possibly the biggest and most rapid increase in inequality that we've ever seen, from a low level to a quite high level. India, a big country with a clear increase in inequality over the last 2 decades. So those and other countries have kind of set the tone for the world trend, which is negative. So high levels getting worse. I want to qualify that in a minute. Economists, I'm typical as an economist. I got a lot of qualifying footnotes to what I say, so I got a couple of footnotes to this. Anyway, within this generally not very positive scenario, we do have, for a number of Latin American countries, we have some evidence that inequality has started to fall. Latin American countries have always been famous since we started to get decent information for their very high levels of inequality, with a few exceptions, but the big countries of Latin America have tended to be up there in terms of inequality. So anybody who is interested in the future, they're kind of waiting to, impatiently and desperately to see some evidence that this level of inequality is going to fall. We have a long-standing theory from Simon Kuznets that there's a kind of normal historical pattern in the course of economic development whereby inequality increases in the early stages and then decreases in the later stages. So anybody who believed that has been waiting for several decades for this decrease in Latin America, which is a relatively developed region as these things go. So there is some evidence from the last decade that inequality is starting to fall. But the qualification to it and the qualification to the accuracy of our information about inequality in general is that we don't measure capital incomes very well. So in any economy, a big chunk of the income accruing to different people comes from labor, and another substantial chunk comes from capital. When you do a household survey, which is the main source of our information on all these things, you get pretty accurate information on labor income, but you get very inaccurate, incomplete information on capital income for a lot of different reasons. One of which, of course, is that the respondent is suspicious that the interviewer comes from the tax office, so obviously you're not going to give them the full story. Anyway, so let me rephrase my belief with respect to Latin America. Income inequality within the labor component of income is falling. See, if overall income inequality is falling, that means that the capital component is not kind of leaning in the other direction. And we don't know whether it is or not because we simply don't have the information. And there's a certain amount of cause for worry because we do know that the capital share of income has been rising around the world for the last 3 decades, for the most part. And so if that component about which you don't know enough to allocate it to different people, if that's rising, then possibly inequality isn't falling yet in the Latin countries. I haven't seen any kind of calculations to work out the likelihood that it is or it isn't, but anyway, we have at least an element of kind of optimism coming from that part of the world, but qualified in the way that I just indicated. So the scenario in terms of what I will now call primary income, that's the income generated to different people in the market. That's a generally negative trend with the possible exception of an improvement in Latin America. But then, as you know, governments intervene, and so we distinguish between pre-fisc, as some people call it, distribution of income before the government taxes you and subsidizes you, gives you pensions and so on, and then the final distribution of income after that has happened. And so in the last 30 years, we have seen increasing activity by governments in many parts of the world in an equalizing direction. So that also has to be taken into account. It's very hard to do so because you have to measure the benefits accruing from the government to individuals. They don't necessarily correspond to the dollar value of the subsidies or transfers or pensions, but it is another consideration. And that there are no calculations, to my knowledge, with respect to the what we call the post-fisc trends in very developing countries. Anyway, I want to, confronted with this kind of either pessimistic or very challenging scenario, come to some of the policy issues as I see them. And broadly, my kind of blanket way of describing the challenge from an economic point of view in developing countries, the single word that one should focus on is remunerative employment, or good jobs. Remunerative, stable, satisfying. That's the single most important variable. More important than growth. That doesn't mean that you can get those jobs without growth, but I think the focus should be good jobs, number, quantity, and quality. And so my other emphases in terms of policy areas, they both relate to getting a lot of remunerative, productive jobs. And I think, just a word on the non-economic front, even if the economics itself didn't say that employment should be the key variable, I think lots of psychological and sociological analysis and a degree of self-reflection should persuade us all that a satisfying job is extremely important. That comes out in the happiness literature, it comes out in the work of psychology, it comes out all over the place. There's a huge difference between a terrible job and a good job in terms of self-satisfaction. So when you put it all together, the focus on jobs, I think, has to be extreme, has to be absolute. So how does one get good jobs? What does it mean to get enough good jobs in an economy? I think that it's universal around the developing world that governments worry about employment. Policymakers realize it's an important variable, but the sophistication with which they approach it is very, very low. And so I think it would be not a wild statement to say that almost no country has a sophisticated, well-thought-through employment strategy. Very sad, but I think true. And economists bear a good deal of the blame for that because we have put so much emphasis on growth, but in any case, we'll share the blame with anybody who will take it. So how does one, and as I explain the importance to me of small agriculture, of microenterprise and small enterprise, you'll see that they all relate to the variable employment. So first policy area that I would focus on is productive small family agriculture. In the history of equality and inequality, I think it's true that all the countries which have eventually achieved growth with equity, low levels of equality, have achieved it through starting with successful small farming. And the reason for that is that, going back to a couple of things that Paul mentioned, and that I understand we're going to hear about on the Pakistani front, small units, whether in agriculture or outside, are much more labor intensive. They create many more jobs, they create more labor income per unit of other factors, which in agriculture the other factor is land. So small farms simply choose technologies that create a lot of employment opportunities. Big farms don't. Just about as simple as that. The difference is horrendously marked. So you can never have growth with equity in a country of large farms operated as large farms typically do, which is highly mechanized or focusing on cattle or something like that in ways which do not create many jobs. So for me, focusing on small agriculture, the way Taiwan did after its land reform in the 50s and 60s, highly successful growth of small agriculture set Taiwan on the path to growth with equity. Taiwan is the single best example, I think, we have of growth with equity in the developing world, and it started there. Now, successful small agriculture requires that land be relatively equally distributed, and then it requires that technological advances come along to increase the productivity of those farms. The technological advances are mainly on the biological front, seeds, green revolution, etc. That was the secret in countries like Taiwan, other Asian countries, and that requires government involvement. It requires the government to be the key actor in the research and diffusion process to make that system work. And a lot of people have a lot of criticisms of the neoliberal revolution in economic policy. But if I were to choose a single area in which I think it's done the most damage, is that it has discouraged public sector research that can support small-scale agriculture. And as a result, we have underperforming countries on the small agricultural front. Parallel to agriculture, when we look at the rest of the economy, manufacturing, commerce, and so on, we once again see this huge gap in terms of employment creation possibilities between the smaller units, which have it, and the larger units, which don't. So the larger units create a few good jobs, the smaller units create a lot of adequate jobs. And as between the two, you should choose the second. Because a few good jobs is no good if it leaves everybody else outside. And that's what the focus on large capital-intensive firms tends to do. This is the missing middle phenomenon that Deepak and others talk about. As a policy area, I'm a great fan of microfinance and a great fan of support for small and medium enterprise, but with the qualification that we don't yet have as much evidence that the policy support can make the difference in this area as we do for agriculture. So I think we need a lot more work in that area. It's pivotal, but we're not as far along in the design and implementation process as we need to be. So to sum it up, what do I mean when I say countries don't have good employment strategies? What I mean is that a good employment strategy is one which looks at each component of the economy, agriculture, manufacturing, services, exports, etc., and each policy area, like the monetary, the macro, the trade, and asks, with respect to each of those, what policies will foster a high demand for labor. And how many countries have that? To have it, you have to bring together around one table the policymakers in all these different areas, and somebody has to either beat their heads together or they have to work well together to develop a coherent strategy that really adds up to something. So what we tend to have in the employment area is a lot of rhetoric and no coherent policy. So not an accident that we have a lot of employment problems, job problems, etc. coming to a head now, in a widespread recognition that developing countries need better jobs, but not a widespread recognition as to why we don't have them, which I think is this lack of organized, coherent employment strategy. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Professor Berry. Our next speaker is Solomon Benatar, an emeritus professor of medicine and the founding director of the University of Cape Town's Bioethics Center. As of 2008, he's been a professor in the Dalhousie School of Public Health and Joint Center for Bioethics at the University of Toronto. So his work focuses on global health and global health ethics, as well as human rights. And his presentation today will be about moving beyond philanthropy to address the structural reasons for poverty. So as he sets up, I will hand it over.
Excuse me for a moment's delay just to put this in. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate the invitation to speak here today. I think I was invited at the last moment, and it's a very difficult presentation to make in a short period of time. So let me just say a couple of things right at the outset. The first is I want to acknowledge the enormous stimulation that I've had from some people in the audience like Richard Sandbrook and Thomas Pogge and Alberia over the years who, from the economic and political science perspective, have played an important part in my education. Second point I want to make is that I'm really just going to give you some sound bites today, and I'm going to be extraordinarily provocative. I've spent most of my life in South Africa battling all sorts of things, and the time has come not to be polite anymore. There are not many years left of life, and certainly not many years left of speaking and addressing audiences, so I'm just going to be provocative. Take it or leave it. I hope that the points will generate lots of discussion. Okay, so let's go with the first slide. The first point that I want to make is that the current structure of the global political economy lies at the heart of increasing disparities in wealth and health within and between nations. That's the heart of the problem. And unless one understands how the political economy has been deliberately structured in a way that will keep poor people poor forever, and unless we do something about changing that, not a lot is going to change. The second point I want to make is that wealthy countries extract more resources from poor countries than they donate. There's an enormous fanfare, smoke and mirrors and hype about development aid, but it's small in comparison to what's extracted. The official figure is something like, for every $1 donated, about $6 are extracted. And remember also that of the $1 donated, 80% of that is spent on people from the so-called donor country implementing the aid. I want to suggest that philanthropy is necessary but not sufficient. I don't want to undermine the role of philanthropy. Some phenomenally good projects have been undertaken with philanthropic resources. I don't want to undermine that. And the final point that I want to make here is that it's not only absolute poverty that must be addressed, but also relative poverty. And I'll integrate that in a moment with some data from South Africa. Okay, so here's a slide from the book by Wilkinson and Pekic looking at the spirit, looking at discrepancies between societies. And this is data from those societies where the data is available. So it's not the poorest countries in the world. And what they're looking at is the index of life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, and all those things listed there on that axis. And the income inequality on that axis, say the Gini coefficient, a low Gini coefficient to a high Gini coefficient, and you'll see the correlation between the degree of inequality within countries and the extent to which all of those adverse social effects operate. And they also show the slide which shows that if you look at absolute income, there's not that same relationship. So it's the relative difference that makes an enormous impact on society, and of course that is what is so important to us in South Africa. This is the distribution of income in South Africa and some of the trends. And let me just show you a couple of things. First of all, Al, to come to you, if you take the top 10% in South Africa, they consume about 58%, they account for about 58% of personal income, whereas the bottom 10% account for 0.3 or 0.4%, so that's a 100-fold difference, not a 50-fold difference, more than a 100-fold difference. Now it's interesting, if you take the first 7 deciles up to the 70% of people in South Africa, 70% of people in South Africa altogether have access to 17% of total personal income. The Marikana miners who went on strike recently and who you saw all about on television, they're in decile 5. And their requirements are to go to decile 7. They claim that they're so poor that they need to go to decile 7 to have a decent standard of living. Almost all poverty reduction strategies are focused on decile 1 and decile 2, and that of course is where the South African government has made a difference. They've implemented social grants and other forms of redistribution that have certainly raised people from the direst level of poverty. But you should know that in the first 4 deciles of South Africa altogether, 40% of South Africans live on less than 450 Rand a month, which is about $20 a month. Or $2 a day roughly, in South Africa. So those disparities are enormous. They're grotesque. They're obscene. There's no future for sustaining those kinds of disparities. So there has to be some ability to get to the bottom of that. Okay, so Millennium Development Goals, are they a priority or are they not a priority? Well, if you look at the expenditure on the military, if you look at how much money was found to bail the banks out during the financial crisis, and you compare that with what we are seeking to find for the Millennium Development Goals, the Millennium Development Goals pale into insignificance in terms of any kind of priority. And so the question whether something that replaces the Millennium Development Goals, unless it's very much more ambitious, that can achieve very much, is open to question. And I again want to make the point that I think one has to come back to the structure. How is our society structured? How have we structured our society? Because it is man-made. Can we restructure it in any way? So you know about the distribution of donations. That's a common graph. Most of the countries lie below the 0.7% level that are required. They should be encouraged to give more. The way development aid is used, the accountability for that development aid needs to be improved. There's nothing that I'm saying today which would suggest that philanthropy or donation of resources from rich countries should not continue, but that is not sufficient. So let me conclude. What I want to suggest is one thing I've said already, is that much donor aid is spent on donor country workers. In the report from CEDA reconsidered, it was found that a lot of money from CEDA was wasted in Africa, largely because 81% of the people who work for CEDA live in Ottawa. And so it's paying salaries for people who live in Ottawa. We need a lot of publicity about how official development assistance is undermined by collusion of wealthy countries with despots and kleptocrats in the process of extracting resources, mineral and other resources and people from those countries. There's an enormous level of collusion and corruption at the level of official development aid, and that needs to be publicly acknowledged. It needs to be documented and made much more accountable. I also want to suggest that sustainable development is not feasible in the context of the excessive consumption patterns and limits to non-renewable resources in the world. Sustainable development means getting richer, and that everybody can get richer, and that increasing richness can be sustained. In the situation as we understand it in the world today, that's an oxymoron. What we really should aim at is something like developing sustainability, which is a change in metaphor and a totally different concept. How do we develop sustainability? How can Canada become sustainable? How can Canada's healthcare system become sustainable? That needs to be the focus, not how we can find more money, because there's not going to be more. We have to do better with less. And I think that's the major challenge. So, economic growth alone is not a solution without both adequate restraints on financial transactions and some form of redistributive mechanism that will narrow the gaps between people in addition to increasing the absolute poverty at the bottom. I haven't argued for all of those points. There isn't time to give you the data for it. There is a lot of evidence for most of those suggestions. There's a rich academic literature. Some of you will be aware of that. And I thought in the short time that I had available today, it would be appropriate for me just to try to make those points to irritate you and to get you thinking along some lines that most polite people, politically correct people, don't necessarily want to think along. Thank you very much.
I didn't even need my time card, so it's exciting. Our next speaker is Murtaza Haider. Is he here? Oh, there he is. Great. Thank you so much. He's Associate Professor in the Ted Rogers School of Management here at Ryerson. He's also the Director of the Institute of Housing and Mobility. And his research focuses on housing markets, urban infrastructure development, and transportation in Canada and South Asia. And his presentation today will be about economic growth, inequality, and job creation within the country-specific context of Pakistan.
My apologies for being late this morning. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. Often the mornings are surprise trips to the hospitals or clinics, so I was a little late. I apologize. As the PowerPoint goes up, my training is I'm an engineer by training. I'm not an economist, so I think given that all these economists are, I can say I can make a lot of mistakes without being blamed for it, because the reason I got interested in this is the travel demand service. As we were doing travel demand service, trying to figure out how people travel, we started looking into the issues with poverty and travel. And the slides that you're looking for are the ones that are the latest. This one.
This one's economic growth and
Yes.
inequality.
Yes. So, by the way, it's good to be on a panel on inequality and being the youngest on the panel. And it's the first panel that I'm on where there are no women talking about inequality, so it's very interesting. Okay, so Basically, what I will talk about is that as the context that has been set, that there are causes and remedies, and they could be different in different contexts. So I will present to you a very focused experiment that happened in Pakistan, and then even then focused in a city in Pakistan. So I'll take you local to the city level, bring you back at the national level, and then discuss a few things that puzzle me a lot and share with you. So what I'm saying is the same, that economic growth is not a good measure when it comes to inequality. And I'll show you why it is in the Pakistani context. And I also feel that when I look at data, and I'm a data cruncher, that often these comparisons that we make, international comparison, global studies where we have panels, what is hidden is the detail, the local detail. And those nuances get averaged out in national panels, and we don't really get the true picture when we look at those studies. So I'm a big fan of doing things local, and that's where my focus would be. So if you have been reading news since 9/11, you would know that since 9/11, the entire US government has been very active in the South Asian region, mainly in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. And what we hear is mostly the Taliban and the terrorism, war on terror. What we don't hear about mostly is the parallel economy that American military interventions create in the regions when Americans are involved. The case in point is Pakistan, where before 9/11, the government of General Musharraf, who was a military dictator at that time, was doing very badly. There was nothing, no GDP growth, no industry, no manufacturing, nothing, everything was slow. And then suddenly 9/11 happened, and then Americans and the banks, commercial banks and development banks showed up and said, well, we have got money. You need $5 billion. IMF said, we will renew it. You want it to be renewed tomorrow, we'll give you today. So that creates this credit economy in Pakistan, and it was a very flourishing economy. Everybody was looking at these aggregate GDP numbers. And during the Musharraf era, those GDP numbers looked very impressive. Suddenly the economy, if you measure it as gross domestic product, started to grow, looked very good on paper. IMF was started to say, look at Pakistan, it's growing again. But at the end of the day, when you break it down, you realize it's the credit economy. The banks were giving out credit, people were buying cars on credit, there were no roads but cars. So this was very interesting development happening in Pakistan. And then the bubble burst, then Americans started to leave, and they're in the process of leaving. So the credit stopped arriving in around 2008. And so you see IMF saying, well, we don't know, we can give you another extension. And the commercial banks are even blunt. They say, okay, thank you very much, nice doing business with you, we are leaving. So last month, HSBC announced, we are leaving the whole country, we're shutting down. They sold their interest to a Middle Eastern bank. And while all this economy is expanding and everything is happening, no jobs are being created. Now, there are some interesting three graphs that I find very interesting. So you're looking at the purchasing power, PPP converted GDP. So on the y-axis, you have international dollars per equivalent adult. And then if you look at this portion of the graph here, you see this tremendous growth. And this is the period 2001, post 9/11 to 2008. And then we see GDP growth, we get credit, everybody's happy. But what's behind it is more interesting than this sudden increase in growth. And at the same time, when you're looking at this growth, if you look at the inflation in the country, and this is what I'm showing you here is the national currency units per US dollars at the PPP level. So let's say how many rupees you need to get $1. And you see that in the same period that you see growth, the number increased from 15 rupees to over 30 rupees, which means that in terms of loosely saying, the inflation doubled. So was it the economic growth, or just looking at an tremendous increase in inflation, and more so in food price inflation? And that was all happening, and we were thinking, look at that economy is growing. And at the same time, if you look at the worker productivity, there's no significant increase in worker productivity, whereas you can see tremendous increase in GDP. So there's a disconnect, and that disconnect seldom gets debated in Pakistani context. So now that I've said this thing, that you can have GDP growth, and you can have all these funny things happening, but then you have tremendous inflation at the same time, contributing to your GDP growth. And at the same time, the worker productivity is absolutely changing, or slight differences which are meaningless. Now let's look at the local level. So let's look at Lahore, which is a city of 6.5 million people, second largest city in Pakistan, economic, cultural hub, a great place, interesting location, right next to India, hardly a 30-minute drive to the Indian border. It could be much more than what it is economically, given the proximity to the Indian markets, but it's not. So we had a travel demand survey done in 2010 there. We got 18,000 households surveyed. Japan International Cooperative Agency, JICA, funded it. It was an interesting exercise. But what I will present to you from there is not more so income, but also about expenditure, because there's always this great divide, as I mentioned earlier, between income and expenditure. They somehow in poor countries do not coincide and match very well. So what you would see from the map is that, and I'm not going to belabor this point, but the key point is that there's great diversity even in income in Lahore level, but if you look at the neighborhood level, and we divided the city into 200 neighborhoods, there's still economic disparity within those neighborhoods as well. So it's not on the city level, but also at the neighborhood level. And here I just show you the basic income statistics. If you take $1 US equal to 90 rupees right now, which is the going rate, but it changes so much daily that it doesn't really matter, then the first two categories, that is between under 10,000 rupees, which is almost 20%, 1 in 5 households, they're very poor. Now 10,000 rupees per household would mean $100 per household per month, which means 6 members per household on average. And then you do the math. You divide $100 by 6, and then divide it by 30, and then you get the per capita earning for the house. So that's the very low income, I would say, but 1 in 5 households. This category here is the not very low income, but low income. There's a small, I would say, middle income, 30,000 to 50,000 rupees category, which is about 14 to 15%, very small middle class in Lahore. And then we have what we would say high income households, representing roughly 10%. What is interesting is how these households spend money, or their physical or possessions. So you would see that obviously the average number of televisions, so mean average number of televisions increase as the income increases, so there's no surprise there. But what is surprising, at least to me, is that even if you are at less than 6,000 rupees, which is $60 a month with a household of say 60 people, 60% of the households have a television. Oh, no, my apologies. 0.6 televisions per household, which means about every 3 households have 2 televisions. And that goes up to 1.6 televisions per household for the high income category. Now, radio being much cheaper, and I would expect radio to be much higher in the low income household. People have just forgone radio for television. And then you see the computers ownership rate. So it goes to 1 computer per household at the high income level, and 0.7 computers per household at the middle income level, and then less than half a computer, or less than 2 households, 1 computer per 2 households for low and mid income households. What is further interesting, and which everybody knows about it, and I've got 5 minutes remaining, is how even the low income households, you have mobile telephones, 0.7 telephone sets per household. And same goes on for the transportation equipment. You could see that high-income households in Lahore, they have more than 1 car per household, and low-income obviously do not have it. But again, I'm surprised to see that the bicycles are not more prevalent in low-income than in high-income. So these are surprises. It's hard to understand. We'll spend some time. So I'm going to just make this one point here, that if you look at the utility bills of the low-income households, you would notice that 50% of the income is being spent on utility bills. What we also know is that the other 50% is being spent on food. So your very low-income households, between utilities and food, that depletes their entire budget, which means nothing is left for education or health and other expenses. So that is a problem, because you have GDP growth, and then you see all these numbers, but then you look at the GDP growth numbers and you look at the low-income prevalence, you see what's going on. I'm just going to make one point here, and the point is that the government of Pakistan states that 6% of the households, a 6% unemployment rate stands today at 6%, which is a very interesting number. It's the same number that the World Bank would then reproduce. It's the same number that you will see in all development studies, because those numbers come from the government. But is it really true that only 6% of the Pakistanis are unemployed? And that too, in the sense that, of the 57 million in the labor force, you have 53 million employed. And then also the government at the same time claims that the war-torn province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the unemployment has gone down, which in reality we all know is because people have moved out because of floods and war. So they haven't gotten rid of poverty, they just gotten rid of poor. So all these numbers then aggregate up and go and forward it to the World Bank and the like, and they reproduce, and we get all these fine graphs. But then at the bottom of it, the reality is that the minimum wage is 8,000, which is roughly $12 per person on a monthly basis in a household. And that's for the people who are, government saying, are employed. And then you have this amazing age pyramid. And if you look at it, people between the ages of less than 15 are the biggest cohort, or less than 25. And in 10 years' time, these guys will move up here asking for jobs, and there are no jobs because the governments can't produce those. And even the job numbers that the governments produce, they're fake. And as the earlier speaker said, there's no real policy in creating jobs, because everybody asks them, World Bank, IMF, CEDA, create growth. And in that dialogue about create growth, nobody's broadening the employment base. And that's a real dilemma. At the same time, you have these Hunger Games in Pakistan. You have these tremendous malnutrition. 44% children under 5 years old in Pakistan are sick. Well, how can 6% unemployment rate can coincide with such a horrendous number? 6% unemployment rate should not have these kinds of real indicators of poverty. That is stunted growth, underweight children. And at the same time, when Pakistan was claiming to be growing under General Musharraf, we saw 43% increase in underweight children in the province of Balochistan. We also saw 20% increase in stunted growth across the nation. So these are humongous numbers. These are numbers that would make any policymaker fear for their jobs or for their lives. But that's not even part of the debate there. And then the last point I'm going to make, because I've left 1 minute, is that there's this elite, the military and the civilian elite in Pakistan has this stranglehold on the economy. Army has its own banks, steel mills, armaments, small arms, cement factories. It controls a large amount of land in cities because of the British tradition. They are cantonments. All coastal areas with anything within 5 kilometers of Pakistan's border belongs to the army. So it has created this state where the entrepreneurial class, the people who are supposed to start the small and medium enterprises, now they are left and they're doing it in Scarborough and Mississauga. So Pakistan's middle class and the entrepreneurial class has moved to Toronto or the suburbs of Toronto. And that's what has happened, because there was a talent flight. The nation has got rid of them. On top of it, you have disasters. And that's where I just want to say that causes matter. And in Pakistan's case, if you exclude the man-made disasters, which is the war on terror, the American war on terror, resulting in 40,000 violent deaths since 2003 alone, the Pakistan's indigenous sectarian and political strife that is contributing to this, and then the earthquakes that have killed 85,000 people in 2005, and subsequent floods where 1/3 of the nation, I think 60% of the farmland was underwater in 2010. So these local situations require us to think locally, because the causes are different and the remedies will be different. And that's why there's merit in thinking about poverty, looking at local numbers, while we appreciate the goals being set on the global level. But there's merit in looking at things locally and be more focused. Thank you.
Okay, so the goal really of the panel for today is to look at general strategies for global poverty eradication. In other words, to recognize poverty as a global problem that requires responses not only at the national level, but also at the global level. And the ASAP network, right, has highlighted the need to reform global institutions, rules, and practices as the way to move beyond the MDGs and tackle global poverty. In other words, ASAP calls for a shift in the primary responsibility or accountability for achieving developing goals away from the developing countries, the recipient countries, and toward the donor countries and the global institutions. So the presentations for today had a bit of a divergence around their level of analysis, right? So Professor Albert Berry and Professor Murtaza Haider were looking much more at domestic structures and domestic practices that perpetuate poverty in the global south, right? Professor Berry looking at strategies focused on small family farming, microfinancing, right, and small and medium business generation, and also Professor Haider looking at household expenditures, food insecurity, and job creation. And the other half of the presentations are more about the global responsibilities, global issues. So Professor Solomon Benatar looking at the need to reform the global political economy, especially foreign aid, and Professor Spence looking at the combination of prosperity with poverty, so growing global growth coinciding with global instability and global warming and the stresses on that. Right, so that's one of the big tensions in the literature. What is the appropriate loci for generating poverty alleviation strategies? In my own area of research, I also tend to look much more at the domestic, right? The challenge is looking upward and outward instead of downward and inward. I also tend to look downward and inward. At indigenous poverty in Latin America is my focus, right? Some of the most marginalized, vulnerable, and excluded social groups, right? Indigenous poverty is rooted in structural and historical factors, and empirical studies looking specifically at indigenous poverty in Latin America found many persistent inequities along ethnic lines. So very few gains in poverty reduction amongst indigenous peoples have been made despite improved social spending on the poor, right? So social and economic indicators for the non-indigenous population has been improving, yet indigenous poverty has remained the same, right? So there is an even wider indigenous poverty gap, right? So the idea that if countries even have more resources flows or more policy autonomy and innovation, will that still reach some of the groups that have additional obstacles, right? So an important tension in the literature and in the field regarding the appropriate location for poverty alleviation. On the one hand, analysts argue that we need to understand why people are poor, how poverty differs across groups, and which policies are most effective for each of these groups. Right? Ethnicity, class, gender, and generational issues may all play a part in constraining the effectiveness of a generalized strategy for alleviating poverty. Right? So following this logic, as I mentioned, increasing the income at the disposal of a country or even at the household level does not address more complex issues of the distribution of that income to more marginalized and vulnerable individuals. But on the other hand, we cannot lose sight of the broader global processes at work that constrain policy autonomy and innovation in recipient countries, as well as sufficient resource flows to improve poverty alleviation outcomes. So one of the larger questions I want to pose to the panelists and also to the room, if people want to address it, and it comes from the High Directive of ASAP, right? So I coincided with that question. So the larger question that we're interested in addressing today on today's panel is how should global policy be reformed to address growth, inequality, and employment for poor people, right? So how should global policy be reformed, right? How should donor responsibilities be redefined to address growth, inequality, and employment for the poor? And what are the engines of inclusive growth? Right, so a central common denominator was a concern with inequality. What are the engines for promoting inclusive growth? Thinking at the larger level, right? Coming up with a larger global strategy for improving growth and addressing inequality and unemployment. right? So if the panelists want to answer, or people in the audience would like to propose an answer, if any of you want to take up that question, and then we will open up to a broader discussion, that would be great. And I think Professor Benatar might want to weigh in on this, because he was a little bit shortchanged with this presentation. So if he wants to elaborate.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity for a couple more minutes for something that I didn't say at the end that I should have said. And if one approaches this problem of the global, the sickness of our world, if you like, as a physician might approach it, the first step is to make the diagnosis. Well, we made the diagnosis. There's been a lot of denial about that diagnosis, and that's usually what happens when you give bad news to people. They deny it in the first instance, and then there's all the bargaining and the Kubler-Ross phases that you go through before you accept the situation. You're now coming to accept that the diagnosis is right. The second step is to understand the pathophysiology. How did we get here? What were the tracks that led us to this particular station that we're parked at? And we're increasingly understanding how those forces operated and how the world was structured in the way it is structured. So we understand the pathophysiology, so that's good. So now the next step for a physician is to say, well, what's the prognosis? And of course the prognosis is unknown, because you've got statistics, you've got data, some people will do well, some people won't do well. There's the possibility of a higher road or a lower road or a middle road, so we can prognosticate and model down different directions. And then of course the next question is the therapy. What do you do? And of course that's the most difficult thing. And let me draw the analogy with the AIDS epidemic. You see, the emergence and spread of HIV/AIDS is a symptom. It's not a disease that you can deal with in its own right. How did it arise? Where did it come from? It came from the spread of a pathogen that affects animals, spreading into human beings and spreading wildly through human beings. We have to understand how pathogens cross species. And if you don't understand that, if you don't understand that HIV/AIDS is a social problem, you'll deal with it as a biomedical problem and you'll never get anywhere. That's the one issue. You have to understand that like AIDS emerged, there are many more other diseases that are going to emerge from the circumstances under which people live today. The writing's on the wall. If we don't understand that and think beyond the box, we're just going to plug away at the old ideas and never get anywhere. So what are we doing biomedically? We're trying to make a vaccine, but that's extraordinarily complicated. And we've been doing that for 10 or 15 years and we haven't got one yet. And how have we done that? We've had grand challenges. The grand challenges have brought scientists together, people who understand every aspect of the pathophysiology of the interaction between the HIV virus and the human immune system. And it's only by doing that kind of research that there's a possibility that we'll find an HIV/AIDS vaccine. And where we are in terms of how do we change the world, how do we change the global economy, I think we're at the point where we need some grand challenges. We really do need that multidisciplinary research work of people coming from different perspectives, seeing the problem in different ways, seeing this very complicated system and saying, what are the receptor sites? What are the nodal points that if we tweak things at that point, things might change in a way in which there'll be positive feedback mechanisms operating in the world. We don't know where they are. And all of us in this room, we're constructed to think that what we're doing is okay. But the world is built for us. 80% of the world don't remotely have what we have. So for us to get out of that box, so to find the donors and the people who will fund the kind of research that will shake the ground on which we are standing is enormously complex and difficult. But we have to face up to it because that is the reality. The reality is that small steps here and there that make people feel a little happier. We can do all of those things. I'm not saying we shouldn't do them, but we have to be very imaginative. We have to think about 21st century solutions to 21st century problems. We're not going to be thinking with Newtonian physics to solve quantum physics problems. 100 years ago, we only had a Newtonian physics. There was no quantum physics. Okay? We're on the cusp of understanding that there's going to be a quantum physics leap in terms of our understanding about how society operates and how we might change it. And I see the ASAP as one of the grand challenges. It's a group of people who've come together, and I don't know of any other group that are doing what you're doing, so all strength to you. But really what we need is multiple groups like this who will do the work independently and come together and try to change the world for the coming generations, because the prognosis looks extraordinarily bleak. And if I'm accused of being pessimistic, well, I look after people with terrible diseases and I watch them die. And I know when I first see them at the first meeting, I know what's going to happen to them because we understand the pathophysiology of disease and how it's going to progress. There are a few successes in some of those areas. But the writing is on the wall, and the challenge is to get that into people's faces, because unless we face it squarely, we're not going to do the things that need to be done. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I'm Veliz from Thorp University. My question is about the recently prominent phrase, inclusive growth. And we know that this phrase has become very attractive in a variety of national contexts, but also in some international contexts as being able to advance poverty eradication and even check increasing levels of inequality. I've been looking at the literature more closely on what exactly inclusive growth means, and there is no consensus. A variety of authors mean different things for this, and some is bringing the benefits of economic growth to the rural sector, other mean advancement of educational opportunities for people who are traditionally left out of educational opportunities. Others seem to point to bringing more of the informal sector into the formal sector. Others point to expansion of infrastructure. So a variety of things pass under this catch-all phrase as inclusive growth. My question is, since this phrase has already attracted some recognition and some acceptance in the international forum, one specific way to contribute to have some impact is to be able to define the content of this term, what this means, and then because it's already accepted in a variety of contexts. So my question is that from your multiple vantage points, micro, meso, macro points from which you analyze the material, what does inclusive growth look like, and what should it look like? Thank you.
I've just got a couple of brief questions and a few comments. Growth, that seems to be the main thing today. I think Professor Randy Spence mentioned something about measurement. So my question is, and a brief comment, there is this pot of money and there is that much only. So we really need to have a balance between how much goes for measurement and how much goes for actually addressing the problems we are trying to measure. Second one on growth, and picking up on the inclusive growth comment that has just been made. Yes, growth we need. Of course, growth is not denied in the shift to non-economic dimensions of poverty alleviation, but growth is not seen as the end, it is seen as a means. So what kind of growth do we need? Do we need the inclusive growth, which in, let's say, the case of India, would mean including, or to some partially including, at least 750 million out of its close to 1.2 billion. India's growth has been robust in the last 10 years and continued good predictions as well. But anything about the 750, it is completely excluded the 750 million that live in its rural areas. So do we need that kind of growth? Overall growth in India is very strong. Or do we need the Chinese type of growth that is feeding the consumer-led lifestyles globally? It's done good for China, to some would say, but that's a question that we need to unpack and answer. No aid is a debate that's now being fueled by the troubled economies in the West itself. There were people from the South, like Tamina Moyo, I think, has written on dead aid. William Easterly is also talked about, is one against aid. But now the economies themselves, the Western economies themselves, are in trouble, and the 0.7 ODA is not likely to be met by even those who promised, other than the Nordic countries. So yes, there are, but with that, my question is, are we not again simplifying and putting that one size fits all? Yes, there are examples, excellent examples, where achievement has been made without sufficient aid, and there are many countries, perhaps including India, that are less aid dependent. But we need to examine that and not simplify that. And the Grameen Bank and the self-help groups, there is much to say about that, but there are pitfalls there as well. So again, it's not, it needs to be contextualized rather than replicating. And the last point is, Professor Berry was talking about revisiting the small enterprises. This is really the debate that was being said, and I support that. This is really Schumacher's intermediate technology, and the book Small is Beautiful. We are really wanting to visit that. The question is how we take this beyond those converted, beyond the academic community, to the policymakers and the powerful big firms. Just to give it a slightly optimistic scenario, beyond microfinance, perhaps the cooperative movement has much to offer, and there are excellent examples where the individuals or the small firms were made powerful or competitive through the microfinance model. But beyond that, in order to compete with the big firms, the cooperative was the answer. In India, the Amul dairy in Gujarat is an excellent example, and the only one that could actually is still competing with the cheese and the milk products that are now flooding the Indian markets. And this has been it was established in the 70s. It spread to most states. So individual milk farmers empowered through microfinance, and then cooperative setup, state-led cooperative setup that are quite competitive.
My name is Mustafa Koch. I'm with the Department of Sociology and Center for Studies in Food Security at Ryerson. I have a couple of questions for the organizers. One is, who's our audience at ASAP? Who are we addressing to? Are we talking to the marginalized people, or are we talking to power? If we are trying to speak truth to power, then my second question is, how are we going to address inequalities of power and inequalities of decision-making process, especially in the policy-making process? How are we going to address the uncontrolled power of organizations such as WTO, IMF, and World Bank, and what have been their role in some of the issues we are dealing with right now? And the final question is, how can we move away from symptoms to causes? Whether it is poverty, whether it is global warming, whether it is hunger, we are talking about symptoms. But from my perspective, I may be wrong, but we have a particular version of capitalism, global capitalism, or neoliberal brand of neoliberal capitalism that has been emphasizing productionism and consumerism for a long decade. And that is, how are we going to, if we are talking about paradigm shift, how are we going to convince the world that we really do need to stop this crazy productionist, consumerist economy? It's not just growth, it's just endless, uncontrollable production and consumption. And
it's a tension between a global approach, global targets, global economies functioning, global politics, and the micro level, project level, community level, at which individuals work one by one. And it's often, there's no link between the two. The UN makes grand declarations. In the field of aid, by the way, the Paris Declaration, Accra Declaration, Busan Declaration, all describe the ways in which aid should be undertaken. There's lots of bad aid, but there's also lots of good aid. There's no shortage of knowledge as to how to do it better. The question is whether there's any link between what people declare at the global level and what is actually done, both by donors and recipients, at the country and project level, at the village and community level. And how one links those two, and at what level one makes targets, is a real question. I mean, one can argue that one shouldn't have more than a few very basic principled targets for the world, which will stimulate people at the national level, community level, to argue out among themselves what realistic targets for their particular place might be. But it's a tension. The second one is between those who are concerned with absolute poverty. And that seems to have been the dominant theme in much of the discussion today. And those who address inequality. There's an obvious link, but it's much more difficult politically to set targets and address inequality than it is to set targets and address absolute poverty, however measured. Growth advocates can always point to examples in which poverty is reduced through rapid growth, but if one tries, and they will push growth on those grounds, but if one tries to address something called inequality, the political resistance is enormous for obvious reasons. And if one sets about targeting at either the global level or the local level, one has to decide which it is that one's prepared to target and how politically feasible it may be to undertake whatever you decide. A third source of tension, I think, is really for Randy, I think, is that between advocates of sustainability, reduced carbon emissions, and environmental concerns, an entire community that is focused on that, and those who are most concerned with poverty or inequality. These are very old tensions. They stem all the way back to Stockholm and before that. But they haven't gone away. They're continuing in UN discussions now of the new development goals. And I'd be interested to know whether you think it's possible to resolve these tensions, because this is an immediate dilemma in New York. Thank you.
Who would like to start?
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. Just thoughts. What is inclusive growth? The best measure we have of inclusion is actually equity. If you have growth and high degree of equity, then you probably have inclusive growth. So the other part of that question is, how do you do it? And I think if I summarize what I've heard today, I would say employment, education, and redistribution are key elements of that. The discussion of aid, I'll just comment quickly. I think if I go back to the Philippines and community-based monitoring, once that system got organized, people got organized at the local level, it made a huge difference that they had some resources. Other than that, there's no point. The resources in that case came from decentralization of government, primarily, and very little from government. So it's the circumstances. Donors can do a good job of providing resources to what people want to do. And that's too often not the case. Neoliberalism. The great irony of this, in my mind, is that the people who preach, the neoliberals are preaching competitive market economics, and they're not practicing it. They're practicing monopolized market economics. And who's in charge? Me and my friends. If we have truly had more competition, it's not a bad competition. It can be very powerful. If we have more of that, then I think we should be doing better. And finally, on Jerry's point, because my worry, I don't know how the environmental and poverty equity agendas are going to come together, but I'm afraid they are going to come together because we're going to have so much damage from global warming that's going to cause huge amounts of poverty. So I think that's an area, and I think a lot of people, are after global warming because they're worried about the environment. But I think it's starting to be the case that we're starting to worry about people much more. back to the size question again, and picking up on Deepak's points and a couple of your points. I think that the policy, the optimal policy package, whatever it is for a given country, isn't easy to figure out. We've got certainly lots of positive experiences of clusters working well, subcontracting working well, and so on. And then we have the negative experiences, the case in India to which Deepak referred. But I think this is unlike small-scale agriculture, where I think we have the model, and all we have to do is pursue the model in a given case, more or less. In this area, I think it's a good deal more complicated for a variety of reasons, but so important that I think we have to learn, experiment, and do the best we can. And one of the ultimate ironies, again, picking up on one of Deepak's comments, and I've seen this in Colombia many times, the children of a successful small and medium firm, because it was successful, they get educated, and they don't want to go back to the business because of a variety of reasons. And as a result, there's a core problem of renewal. So there are all sorts of complications here. And then I want to pick up on education in general. What can it contribute to the resolution of inequality, poverty, dissatisfaction, and so on? It obviously can contribute a tremendous amount because illiteracy is a terrible thing. But up at the middle levels of education, what we're increasingly seeing contributing to the so-called jobs crises is rising aspirations, rising faster than the potential of the market to respond, and leading to a lot of frustration, enormous frustration we've been seeing in different parts of the world for the last 40 or 50 years of the developing world. And it's now a major contributor to dissatisfaction, this mismatch. And in the economic literature on education, which I must say the educationalists denigrate and dump on with considerable reason, we collectively, the high voices, oversold the economic benefits of education. I think that's very clear now, because it was for econometric, methodological reasons, and probably for other reasons. So rising education, absent other important inputs to growth and equitable growth, may not have any economic payoff at all, and it may impact maybe frustration. So I think this is one of the great challenges that we face at this time, how to factor in something which is a human right on the one hand, but is associated with aspirations that simply cannot be satisfied if you oversell it enough.
Just two quick points. The first, with respect to the question, what is inclusive growth or growth, whatever you want to call it? And see, I don't know if it's right to pose the question in that way, because I think it's going to really vary from place to place. And I think there's a huge contextual aspect to it. Unless you're talking at a really, really kind of generic or abstracted level. But if you do that and kind of point to some really generic features of what constitutes inclusive growth, I think the other distinction that has to be brought out is not only between absolute poverty and inequality, but different forms of inequality, in particular absolute versus relative inequality. One looking at percentage changes, the other looking at actual in-pocket amounts and the gaps. And I think that's another big tension in the literature. And once again, this just serves to illustrate the point that definitions matter. How you define this stuff in the first place drives, how you gauge success or failure. The other second point I want to make, and this bears on that kind of what to do question. And I kind of share some of the skepticism about aid And this isn't a goody-baddy issue. There's good aid and there's bad aid, we know that. But really as catalyzing transformative change where you've seen real big improvements in living conditions over the medium term, I'm not convinced that aid really was the key ingredient in many of these success stories. But I think that another area to look at is the nature of the international economic system. And parts of it are really gaming against countries in the global south. And for example, the WTO, the accession process, there's huge advantages to incumbents. They have all the cards in their hand. And further, the adjudication process within the WTO, so whoever can afford these huge batteries of lawyers to adjudicate on their behalf, we stand at a huge advantage relative to others. I know Jerry has been involved in this for many years. So I think when thinking about stuff to do or where to lobby or advocate, I think the latter sets of issues are at least as important as other stuff.
There's this question that we started looking at entrepreneurship is why the small and medium enterprises are not growing and creating the employment base. And there are several reasons for it. I'll just mention two, and there are certain components, just two factors that we perhaps didn't discuss. One is the role of governments. And strictly focusing or limiting myself to the subcontinent, the Indian-Pakistan congregation experience, the governments borrow tremendously from local and international banks, especially commercial banks, and they often squeeze out the private sector. So that's a big deterrent, big barrier for growth for small enterprises because a lot of borrowing takes place by the government itself. In the case of Pakistan, the government just simply borrows almost all available capital from it, and because of the deficits and because of the problems with the balance of payments. The other big issue is that the private sector itself, the way it's organized and the way it's structured, not just in the subcontinent or the developing countries, but even in North America, we have the worst income inequality in the US of the past 30, 40 years. The situation now is worse and has never been this bad in the past 30 or 40 years. But in the developing country context, the entitlements and endowments that the private sector, larger families have, is another barrier. So if you're familiar with the Indian situation, you have the Birlas and the Tatas from yesteryears, and you have the Ambanis from today. And the system of inheritance that we have will safely transfer wealth to successive generations, keeping the have-nots outside. So while we look at governments, we have to look at ourselves as well. We have to realize that perhaps it's time to have a serious conversation about poverty alleviation by starting a serious conversation about inheritance laws, because as long as these laws exist, money will remain within a very tight control. Assets will remain as endowments and entitlements, and we will continue to debate this. If you want to have distribution of resources at a level that is needed to get 750 million people out of poverty in India and another 500 million people out of poverty in South Asia, then you start looking at what role it plays in limiting people's access to resources so that they can grow enterprises to get out of poverty.
I just wanted to follow up on that point with a historical example, looking at the record of industrial countries in terms of, over the long run, in terms of inequality reduction. And a lot in the 20th century, inequality came down in I think all of the industrial countries, brought down quickly in many of them by the wars and the Depression. Those are the two single most important features which brought inequality down. And those are kind of sad recipes to be drawing on. But, and then, as you're saying, the last few years, last few decades has seen inequality rise in just about all of the industrial countries. And the major exception is Japan. Japan had the most rapid and most severe decrease in inequality during the Second World War, and it is the single country, as far as I know, which has been able to retain inequality at that low level. And the main message is that the tax system with the inheritance tax without. So I think that kind of comparative historical experience underlines very strongly what you're saying.
Thank you. I will take the question to the organizers. The Mustafa, you asked us some very hard questions. So what we were asked is, who do we talk to? Do we talk to people or do we talk to power? And what power do we have to overcome strong interest in political powers that would oppose the agendas that we're promoting? So my best short answer for you is stick around for tomorrow when we'll talk about what our plan is to try to achieve that. And also you can read about it a little bit in the booklets that's distributed together with the agenda. But in a word, I can say that we have to talk with people and to power. And I think that the only power that we have is the power of legitimacy. And that will come through two dimensions: the legitimacy of academic expertise and authority, and the legitimacy of participation of those whose interests are affected. And we need to learn how to have that conversation, which we usually don't have. And more about that, you can hear from Mina, who's leading our participatory consultation project, and tomorrow when we discuss the post-NDG issues.